So my name is TJ Randall, and I run the customer success team at XebiaLabs. Just to give you a little background, I don't run a traditional services organization. So for us, customer success, it really is about the journey. That word gets used an awful lot. But I promise you, as a customer of XebiaLabs, we work very closely with you. So there's the implementation part, and kind of like if you were here and heard what Ting just kind of described, the getting started part. But really what we find in most DevOps initiatives and most transformations with your organization, you have to do this in piecemeal. You have to start small and you have to build that out. So one of the ideas for the talk today, I wanted to be able to give you two pieces of information from the field. So in my job, in my life, I travel to a lot of real customers who are doing real implementations. So I kind of think of myself, the one benefit that I provide is, you have the kind of, this is what you could do. I deal with a lot of people of what they're actually doing and the roadblocks that they tend to hit and the problems and those types of things. So today we're going to talk about one of the key concepts, which is the ability to be able to express cost in terms of all of this. So as we all know, and again, pointing to Ting, he already pointed that out, you have to sell this internally. So for most of the people that are, even if you're not using XebiaLabs tools, even if you're just trying to bring in open source tools, you have to sell that to your organization. So obviously you have to be passionate about the tech, but you also have to be able to influence people to change. So cost is an important part of that. And then the other piece I thought could be interesting for folks is things that I see in terms of implementation for these types of transformations, these DevOps transformations. What types of risks are out there? Like, how do I identify risk in my change? So the argument here for all of this is, like I just said, so the success of implementing DevOps or anything else is the ability to express value. So what we're going to talk about today a little bit, we're going to deep dive in how do I calculate value? And how do I identify risk to your investments, right? You're making investments, and it's not just in terms of money, right? It's your, some of you, it's your career, right? You're saying, I'm going to put my name on the line. I want to change our organization to do X, Y, Z. That's a big risk. And then how to help accelerate your work. So silos, the DevOps, you could get DevOps logos, the silo is the biggest part of it. But what we tend to see at XebiaLabs is this. Every organization is trying to change. Obviously, we're in a space where people come to us to talk to us and they're saying, we're trying to change, we're trying to speed up. But one of the interesting things we always find is, everyone says, oh, we're going to get rid of the silos, we're going to get dev and ops together. But what's an interesting kind of thing is most organizations, actually their development team isn't one team. Right? They tend to talk about dev because there's a CIO up here, and hierarchically, they all kind of, turn into dev. But I don't know about the folks in the room, but this is generally what we see, which is you have all these dev silos themselves, and then operations is kind of the one who's trying to handle all of this. So this is what happens today. People are solving problems today. People are delivering code, people are writing scripts, people are automating. But what we tend to see an awful lot at XebiaLabs is they're doing that individually. So you'll have your web teams already solved half of the deployment problems, but then you have apps coming in from your offshore teams and they're a totally different beast. So imagine your release weekend. Is anybody here from the operations side of the house, roughly speaking? Development side? Okay, a little bit of both. Isn't that question's going to be obsolete in about 10 years too, but for the most part. Okay, so again, what we tend to see a lot in terms of implementations of all of this is that what we're really working on is trying to figure out how do we get the different silos to at least agree to take a look at each other's solutions. What am I solving over here that maybe you've solved in a different pattern, okay? And again, how do you do that? You basically have to be able to say, hey, it's worth your time and it's worth your investment to make that change. Okay? So the cost of an application delivery, and I always say that application is another word that doesn't really mean what it used to mean, right? We use that in quotes. But this is the biggest message that I bring when I'm working with customers is you have to be able to understand how much your application delivery is costing you, the real cost. So even Ting's slide that he put up earlier, how many people were here for Ting? I'm going to stop referencing him. There was a lot of you here. I was sitting in the back, right? Ting put numbers up on the board. You hardly ever see that. Do you ever notice that in a lot of DevOps presentation? It's a lot of unicorns and roses, and there's not a lot of dollar signs on the screen. I love the fact that he said, this is what this costs us. And what I would say to you, Mr. Customer, you're not even looking at the whole cost. This is what we're going to talk about now. Okay, so when we talk about this concept of cost, do you ever notice that the conversation tends to go around specific areas of your organization? So people say, well, we want to make this transformation. Here's what it's going to cost our development teams, right? These are hierarchical concepts. It's almost like built into the way you think of things because your organization is structured this way, right? You have a CIO and he has 3 directors, and then those directors have, managers, et cetera. So there's kind of this cost of dev, there's cost of operations, and what does operations budget looks like. A very popular way of costing all of this is across project. So a lot of people today still say, okay, if I'm going to implement DevOps, it has to be part of a project. So all of a sudden now, if you're trying to sell your solution, right, if you think, hey, I want to implement this solution, now I'm tied to actually a project budget. That's a tough place to be. And then there's also, obviously, the cost of outsourcing, right? That was going to be the magic bullet that solved all our problems, and then we realized we introduced new problems. What we're calling out here, what we're actually going to start to study a little bit is none of these cost centers, as you know, can accurately cost the whole thing, right? Because what you're going to hear me say for the next time we're together is my constant theme is we're always talking about development to production. And whatever that means for your particular stack, your delivery pattern, okay? So we always want to talk about cost and value in terms of how much does it cost me to get it from dev to production. Make sense? Okay. And this came up, I was at another customer, and this is actually an older slide, I don't know why they use this one, but they were kind of like talking about, we're going to actually add real value to, by implementing DevOps. And I don't know, you guys have seen like IT show. I know it's kind of tough to see, but you can imagine like in IT, I love the red pointer by the way, really this is the software section, right? So if you're going to try to express DevOps costs in terms of software, even that gets a little odd because it's not really just software, right? It's changing your teams. You're going to hire new people and actually reorg, your structure of how you deliver software. So all of a sudden, cost gets buried really fast. And I personally think that this is why you see a lot of pushback when you are out trying to sell your solution to your company. Because people are thinking in these kind of traditional terms. You're like, wait a minute, if you're going to bring in, I'll use XebiaLabs a lot for this example, obviously. But if you're going to bring in a tool, so it must be in our hardware budget, that's where we're going to cost this. And you're like, yeah, that is part of that, but it's not the total cost. Okay. Does this seem pretty relevant? Are you guys already fighting this battle today? Are you already fighting the cost battle?
Well, we resolved a lot of that. All the DevOps people used to have to charge their time against specific projects.
Yeah.
So our boss last year said that's just crazy talk. That's like the crazy train all the way.
Yeah.
So we all charge one number for all the
interesting.
DevOps.
Okay.
It all goes to overhead because that's we cover the entire enterprise.
Interesting. So no matter what project you're using, or let's say you're project-based, that my time, if I was working on that, would be charged to that one particular project.
How much time does it cost each person to administer 20 different projects in a week? Just how much time you put on. That's what we used to have to do.
Yeah, right.
It's hours per person.
Sure, sure. And it's actually hours that they're not being productive, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And did you?
Well, on the previous slide, I wondered if you considered cost of compliance. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, like, it's the whole slide thing. We could go cost down that left side. There's 1,000 ways to try to slice and dice that cost. Compliance actually becomes very relevant because we don't tend to think of that cost until we're getting very close to production, right? How many times does that happen where, you put a lot of time and energy in automating down on the dev side, which is good, but at the same time, the worst time to start thinking about application delivery compliance is in pre-prod, okay? So we have a way to solve that, by the way. I'm gonna get to that in a little bit. Okay, so the two things that we're going to walk through now. So this is the worst way to do a presentation in the whole world. I'm already warning you now, besides the fact it's nice and sunny outside in the time, is I'm going to put some spreadsheets up in front of you. But I'm going to share, the nice thing is these will be available for you. I can share these out so you can use them yourself. They're not proprietary or anything. What I'm hoping to do as part of this session is get your gears kind of grinding. Like, okay, I see something here that I can use. Okay? So we're going to test your eyes a little bit. We'll see if anybody can read the bottom line. But again, for us at XebiaLabs, the constant message is we talk about dev to prod. And the reason for that, by the way, and you guys already know this answer, it's totally easy to automate in dev. Anybody can automate in your dev environment, okay? It's really hard to automate in production. Would agreed? No agreed? Somewhere in the middle? Okay. So that's why we tend to focus on that. So some prep work. Let's talk about this because again, even the word application isn't as relevant anymore, right? Because application is a little blurry. The same in terms of releases. Like, what is a release? So the hard part about doing a presentation like this is each one of you has a different release pattern. They tend to fall in like general groups, like maybe you're a traditional organization that deploys on Saturday night once a week. Maybe you're an organization that bundles, you make all your changes in an agile form, but then you have one large release every 3 months, right? Most of the customers we deal with are not the Etsy's that are deploying every 26 seconds. Okay? So what I want you to just think about, we're going to be a little open-minded for this discussion, is what is this release that we're talking about? And then the other thing that I really challenge folks with is I always say you have to think about everybody, all the people that are involved with your process from dev to prod. Okay? You notice my theme there, the dev to prod? You guys are going to stop saying that, TJ. Okay. So, and I'm going to use XebiaLabs as the tool here. But of course, today there's been plenty of presentations. There's a lot of tools being implemented across your organization. So I'll just use ours as kind of a talking point if you guys have questions. Okay. So the first suggestion I have for you is to think about costing your release process. I want you to think about the people and the releases. All right, that's how we're going to kind of box this up for you to think about. So we're going to estimate applications, releases, staff. And what does that really translate to? Again, I'm taking a spreadsheet and I'm copying it over for you. We'll share these out. But the idea is when you start to think about what you're doing today, remember we talked earlier about goals. This is an important part of your goals. Like everyone says, oh, I want to do triple the releases next year. You're like, well, that's a good goal, but what does that really mean to your organization? Does it mean all releases? Is it the teams that are transforming, et cetera? But if we do some simple calculations, so we say, okay, this year we're currently supporting 10 applications, next year it'll be 20, and then we want to kind of define what a release is. So for this exercise, generally speaking, there's really 3 types of releases, right? You have your planned releases, you have your emergencies, or your patches, or your hotfix, whatever your organization calls them, and then of course you have your failed releases, the ones that don't go quite like we hope. So if we kind of, in the spreadsheet, we kind of calculate those out. The other pieces of information that we feel are important for you to consider are, what's your average time per release? Now this is post-build, right? We're not talking about like compiling code and those types of things. What we're talking about now is the developer says, like for an example, the developer says, I'm all done in dev. So this is now the journey of that application as it gets released from QA to pre-prod to stage to prod, whatever your path of your environments are. So here I've kind of estimated out, we'll say a normal release, a planned release is about 128 hours, okay? Total time for all the people, as well as an emergency release, 25 hours. These numbers will vary according to your organization, all right? But you guys kind of see where I'm going? Is it getting hotter in here as we go through the numbers? The other thing that I think is important that people tend to gloss over is, again, I focus on the people here, is who's actually dedicated to doing your releases? Now, everyone will generally answer that, well, like, oh, we have 3 release managers, that's who does it. And you're like, is that really how it works? So if you have a failed release on Saturday night, who gets on that phone? It's usually a developer, right? The guy who wrote the code. Then you have the QA person. Then you have the PM. And then you start adding to that list. So when I challenge you to think about this, I really want you to think, who gets involved with these events? All right? And then when we talk about this, the one other thing on the spreadsheet that we call out is, how much time are people spending on these? And this is where it gets kind of hard to see, so I'll just kind of go over some high level. But if you think about a release manager, for example, one of the things their job generally tends to be is like they move applications across the release pipeline, right? So a release manager picks it up somewhere around QA and starts moving it towards production. They also ensure like the environments are consistent, things like that. So what we like to do in terms of expressing cost and value is how much of that is spent in normal operations during planned events versus like emergency releases, like the oh shoot moment, like, uh-oh, we got to make this patch to prod. Your developers, generally people don't think of them as being dedicated to releases because they think of them as just writing code. But I don't know about your organization, but most organizations that I see, your developers actually follow the code up through production, sometimes willingly, sometimes client. But then we have the idea of a build engineer, right? Usually that's the person that the DevOps people first tend to hire because they think, oh, if I build a build engineer, right, I'm going to build this guy and he's going to solve all my problems. Except, I don't know if you noticed that, but a lot of times with build engineers, they actually don't know the applications that you're releasing. So now they're being handed the responsibility of knowing everything about deploying the app, and they actually don't know the application. So not a bad idea, by the way, but they're just one part of that delivery pattern. And then, of course, operations, and I like to call out there too, is that number is never 100% because operations is really concerned with keeping your your production environment's online. So in terms of releases, it's actually sometimes hard to figure out, like, how much time are my operations people spending on deploying applications? So again, a good thought exercise for you and your teams is to say, for these roles, for these people, how much real time are they spending? The nice thing about that, the one thing, obviously, staffing always comes into this, you're going to estimate your staff costs, okay? This varies where you're at, but again, for the presentation. And again, I apologize because, again, this is the eye chart. But the nice thing about the spreadsheet that I'll provide for you is the ability to now say, okay, if I have these folks, these roles, this is what they're costing me, this is what generally they're doing, you know, a day-to-day basis in a planned release, these are the types of things I can expect, right? I have my current costs if I don't do anything, as well as if I, you know, start to implement tooling. So from an approach perspective, does that make sense? Does that seem like a way to present the information? People are now checking the numbers like, there's no way that's true. That's okay. But so the interesting thing about this approach, I find, is this was done for a couple different customers where they wanted the ability to show, if I'm going to take this chance, if I'm going to implement the tools, what can I expect up front? It's a very valid question, right? You're making an investment. So therefore, this was one of the approaches that we provided for them to say, okay, here's how you can start to think about that in terms of, here's what's going to change. Oh, actually, you know, there's one other piece I left off, I just realized that, but there's actually one of the things, the assumptions in here, there's a question. It says, how many more releases are you going to do next year? So I apologize, I just realized I left off the slide. Because what you're actually seeing in terms of, you have this idea that says, here's what I'm currently doing, here's my expected scale, meaning I'm going to deploy more apps next year. That's where the numbers. Okay, so let me stop for just a second. Has anybody ever done this exercise within your organization? Has anybody ever gone through and actually costed out your release? Yeah, and did it look a lot like this, a little like this?
Similar, I mean, all the same people are there. It's a little bigger, but say like operations, some people we don't need there unless there are problems. So
Okay.
they're on standby. The release managers typically manage multiple releases at once because they're only needed to execute it.
Okay.
Like in our environment, the spreadsheets that the release managers use look identical to how you manage it with Excel release.
Oh, I see.
So they're already doing a good job with that, but so the money I attach to this, like you have here, is our business case of why Excel release is a good tool.
Okay.
Because here's all the costs of getting everyone together, the giant 50-person phone call and everyone's time on
Right.
Friday night, which is when we do our releases, into Saturday with post-release
Right.
stuff on Monday.
Right.
So it's significant savings.
Okay. And did this help you in kind of your cause of being able to say this is a valid investment?
Yeah, a lot of people looked at the cost and said, how can this possibly be true? Why are we spending this much money now on releases, and why is it so little when you get rid of all that?
Right.
Because people don't have to be there all the time.
That's right. Yeah.
They don't use email as much.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know, so
Cool. Thank you for that feedback. Anybody else? Anybody else on similar exercises? Or are you looking forward to the spreadsheet? You can do it. All right. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So let's say you didn't like that optic, by the way. That first optic is usually one that I have when I'm talking in terms of implementations and people trying to grow organically. Oh boy, I got to get moving. This is another optic in which you can change. So same process. I'm going to move a little quickly, by the way. I promise you can have the spreadsheets. We can talk about this. But now we're going to hyper focus on the delivery in between dev and prod. Okay? So this is a really, really bad slide, I promise. But you notice we're doing the same thing. Your costs of your staff. But the only thing I've introduced in this is now I'm starting to say, how many releases are you doing in the middle of environments? Okay, so see how we're changing the conversation just a little bit. Same approach, but now what we're trying to get people to focus on is, I'm doing events, like if I have a traditional dev, QA, pre-prod stage and prod, each of those takes up time and resources every time I deploy to those environments, right? So you have this release process, but now we're just focusing a little bit more on the events of deployments, okay? And then conceptually what we start to do is estimating hours and error rates to those environments. Because I don't know about you guys, but for example, most companies that I've worked at, like QA, they don't tend to be technical in terms of deployments. They tend to take the code more than being actively part of the deployment, but they tend to spend a lot of time reacting to failed deployments, right? So your QA folks are like, oh my goodness, what did you guys just drop in there? All right, so being just cognizant of time, what we're able to do by filling out that kind of information, all of a sudden, and I know I totally glossed over an awful lot, but some of the other things we talked about is how many releases are you doing into production in terms of like big releases, small releases, and then in time to fix errors. But what we're able to do with this type of approach is we're able to say, look, here's the cost of your deployments from the developer changing that code, right? You know, the metric we all use, to production, as well as unexpected outages. That's another one that people don't tend to cost. Right? It's expensive to fix an outage in production, yes? Okay, so with this model of expressing cost, the only thing you really are going to change here is what I want you to think about is, if I implement a solution, again, I'm using XebiaLabs for a talking point, if you implement a provisioning solution, if you implement a testing solution, what can I expect in terms of reduction of deployment effort, manual configuration, and reduction in errors? Right? If you're going to implement Chef, all of a sudden configuration time should go much lower, right? So if I implement that, what is the cost of that? Make sense? I know I'm talking a mile a minute, I apologize. But at the same time, again, tough to read numbers, I apologize. But I can guarantee you, and this is kind of tried and true in the field, your applications from dev to prod, if you did this exercise, you'd be amazed at how many zeros are after the first couple numbers. Because most of the time we don't consider things like redeployments. Like how many times does your QA team have to take new code changes because your developers didn't get quite right the first time? There's 2 hours. There's 2 hours every time we redeploy. So this approach, a little different metric, a little different way of looking at it. But again, the idea is it helps you express to, like, for example, upper management. This is the real cost of these things. Make sense? Okay. Great. So now we've identified it. My biggest challenge back to you is, we'll share these types of tools with you, and I'm more than happy to have longer conversations about this. But really what I want you to hopefully can take away is, how can you use this concept of computing cost in your organization as you go back out and sell? Okay, hopefully it seems relevant. And if you have other ways that you've done that, I would love to have that feedback as well. Okay, so I'm a Navy guy, and this is pretty much what my Navy career kind of summed that up. So. Just kidding. All right. So what I'm going to do really quickly now, what do I have for time? 7 minutes. Okay. So when I sit down with a customer, so a lot of times I'm working with customers as they start that journey with XebiaLabs, right? So they may be somewhere along like the DevOps continuum. They may be just, as the bridge analogy went, maybe they're in like the no DevOps state. They don't have anything, but they've decided to even talk to us in terms of like a trusted partner. But I can imagine for most people in the room, these are the types of goals you would all agree that people are looking forward to solve in their organization, right? They want to release more. They want to keep employees happy. By the way, do you ever notice how often like these things down here tend to be higher than the keep employees happy? I don't know why that is. But auditing, reducing failures. What was that? Okay, so this is what folks are looking for. They come to us and everybody wants the picture of DevOps, right? This is what DevOps should be. Do you ever notice that most of the time when we implement DevOps, this is what we get a lot of, right? And it's not because people aren't trying, right? People are trying to make positive changes. So one sentiment I hear over and over in my life is, I'll talk to someone in the some director, the CIO. We're having conversation. They're like, I'm making investments. I'm trying to make changes, and it's not working. What is going on? How come these changes aren't working? So my advice, this is what I tend to see day in, day out. You either get one of two things. When everyone talks about dev, you either get strong dev, small ops, small dev, strong ops, okay? So everyone talks about the barriers, the silos, the whole thing. But this is what I'm trying to provide for you today. This is from what I see in the field. Here's your warning signs that your investment may still have a problem. Again, I'm not just talking about XebiaLabs at this point. You're going to implement Chef. You're going to implement OpenShift. These are the things I want you to think about. 1, your dev team, they're using tools for delivery of an application that your production side of the house isn't using. I think we've all experienced this for the most part. People nod their heads, right? Why is that? Because it's easier to do in dev, right? It's easy. I can write scripts all day long. So again, those are the things you're listening for in terms of your initiative. Second, dev isn't providing what other teams need. So do you ever have this example, like your dev team's using Jenkins and they get really pissed, you're like, I use QA as an example a lot. They get really mad when QA says, well, what's in this code? And they're like, well, check the Jenkins log. To me, that's the equivalent of saying, like, we all drive cars, right? There's a computer in your car that's calculating the temperature of your engine, and there's massive amount of data in that computer that can tell you at any point in time what the temperature of your engine is. I don't know about you guys, but I just want to know the gauge that says it's hot or cold, right? So the minute your dev team starts responding to your organization of check the logs, you might actually have a problem in terms of how things are working. The other one I see quite a bit is dev is providing this concept of, like, they just package the code up and they give the spreadsheet and they want to hand that off. As we've even been talking a lot about today, that's an organization where that kind of dump and run to the next project, yes, they have timelines and they're trying to get that work done, but it doesn't work for the rest of the organization. Okay, so how to resolve this? What we find works really well is the concept of making sure you're defining your paths to production. So really what developers want, if you don't know this, if you're not on the dev side, they want an easy way to run code in target environments, okay? They want the easiest possible way to get from dev to prod. And it's not because they're lazy, it's because they have somebody on their side hammering them for the next set of changes. How do we do that? How can we enable that to get that from strong dev to strong ops? Define your paths in such a way so you still meet all the rules for your organization, right? Those don't go away, but they can as easily as possible get their changes into production. And I know that's relative per your company, per your vertical, etc. The other side, the small dev, the strong ops. What are your warning signs of this? Well, one, I see this an amazing amount of time. Your operations side is actually the one who's writing the scripts to do the deployments. So they're like, I don't care what the dev team's doing, I can't control the dev team, so we're gonna fix the problem. Well, you're fixing the problem, but guess what? You still have two different deployment patterns. So yes, you're fixing the problem in the last mile, right, to get it in production, but again, this is a warning sign. This is something that should tell your teams, we have to address this. There's a cultural thing at risk here. And then the manually intensive process for meeting operational requirements. So who here has been in that situation where operations has a book about that big that is like, it's like interpreting a refrigerator model, and you got to hand that to a new guy. So you just hired a developer, and the developer's like, he's all fired up, he's ready to go, and you're like, oh, here's how you get a change in prod. You're like, how do they interpret that? So how do we resolve this kind of too strong of ops, not enough strength in dev? Honestly, from the field, what I see more often than not, it's a meeting of the minds. It's the head of development and the head of operations, and they go sit with the CIO for a little while and say, how are we going to change our organization? I always call it the dad meeting, right? You're like, come on, guys. If dad's got to get involved, it's never good for either side. All right. Yeah? All right, I'm running out. So I say the DevOps credo. Have you guys ever heard this? Lyndon Johnson said, it's always better to have your enemies in the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Well, in a way, DevOps is kind of funny like that, right? People, we talk about those silos, they want to do their own thing. Am I done or? Okay. So this is my last bit of advice for you. How do we solve this problem? Everyone wants to do their thing. Everyone wants to solve the problem their way. We have a consistent approach at XebiaLabs. When we sit down with a customer for the first time, we force a meeting with all those people involved in the release delivery. And it's a 2 to 3 hour meeting. We bring pizzas. It actually tends to be a little fun at the end. It's not fun in the beginning. But what we do is we go around the table of all the people responsible for delivering those changes, and we ask each one of them, what do you need? Now, what you tend to get in that meeting is, they look at me like, oh, here's a cool guy from XebiaLabs. Why is he asking me? It's documented. Well, I know that guy already. It's documented. Tell me what it is, right? Or your development team who says, I don't even know how to get into prod. The reason why that meeting works, that forcing of the meeting of the minds, I guarantee this, you'll find this in your organization. There'll be one person at that table who's involved with your release delivery process who's never been asked that question. It's kind of like that historical thing of like, we need these things in operations, development does their thing their way, and all the things in the middle. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of institutions where they'll have business people come in and test in pre-prod, or staging, before it goes live in production. Now, when you have a failed deployment in pre-prod, all of a sudden that environment's down. You just canceled all those business people actually had to put calendar invites in their schedule, right? To take that time out of their day to come and test. Now all of a sudden a failed deployment, they're like, what do we do? Do we hang out? Do we go back to work? Right? When you have this roundtable meeting and you bring the business in, that's an interesting conversation. Because you know what they get really mad about? They're like, oh, you guys failed the deployment. I took 4 people off the floor. You didn't tell them. You see where I'm going with that conversation. So that's my recommendation. My final recommendation is whenever you're doing these initiatives, bring all those people together. Force that conversation. And what you're going to find out is what is the standardized ways to get to prod, because now you're going to know what things need to be accomplished. Okay? And then I thought it was actually funny. Gene said that today about the board that got, what is it, LARB? Or that was actually really, yeah. This is actually a new thing I've seen is people are getting rid of the classic architecture board. And does anybody here have an architecture board? Okay. Do you ever notice this about the architecture board? It's really smart people, and you go to talk to them about software, and what they focus on is the software. They don't focus on, and it's not a knock, I don't mean it in a negative way, but they don't tend to focus on what the architecture means or what the architecture or the software means for the organization. So one of the things that I've seen a couple customers do this where they have like this DevOps advisory board. So instead of focusing on the software that you're trying to implement, what they also try to do is say, who are the people involved with this software? Who's going to be affected? How is their day-to-day job going to be changed? I'll give you an example. You have if you have an auditing team, today they have to provide audit reports, and they do that, maybe they go through emails, maybe they read log files, maybe they do XYZ. Now you're going to bring in Excel release. Those auditors need to understand, how am I going to do my job in the new world? Like, what does this look like, right? So where am I going to look to do my job? So this is an interesting approach to that in the sense that forces that conversation. What is the people, process, and tools changes in terms of bringing in software? So now you're not meeting a checkbox of like, does the software pass a security scan, et cetera. Now you're really talking about a DevOps review of what you're trying to change. So that's it. Looking at time. Is there any questions, comments, concerns? All right. Thank you.